Hi, everyone. You're listening to Bach Talk, a podcast created by members of the entomology department at Michigan State University. My name is Sophia, and today's guest is Ned Walker. Hi, Ned.
Hello.
Thanks for coming on to the podcast. And I want to start off with asking you a little bit about your background. So, why don't we start off with who you are, and then you can maybe continue and tell us about where you grew up and where you went to school.
I grew up in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region. My parents were from northern Minnesota, and I was born in Indiana, South Bend, Indiana. But I mostly grew up in Northwest Ohio, right along the shores of Lake Erie in a little town called Port Clinton. And I spent most of my school years there, graduated from high school there. It was a great place to grow up. For several reasons. And one was it's kind of a vacation land area. People go there. There are Lake Erie islands that people visit. There's a lot of water activity like fishing and boating and swimming and this sort of thing. But that's really also where I got my first kind of, shall we say, awareness of insects for several reasons. One was that's Western Lake Erie, which is the most productive part of all of the 5 Great Lakes. And one of the reasons is it's pretty shallow and it has sort of a sediment base to it. And there's a large population of Hexagenia mayflies that live in Western Lake Erie and even up into the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair. And it's a notorious annual event, this huge emergence of mayflies, and people
Why is it notorious?
It's notorious because there are millions of these insects that come out within about a week's period of time, and they cover the buildings. There have been periods where the snowplows have to come out and actually plow the insects off of the streets.
Oh, wow. It's like
and
locusts.
it's sort of like that. And in fact, some people used to call them Canadian soldier flies, as if there was an invasion from the Canadian side of Lake Erie. There's a lot of local kind of, lore wrapped around that. So that was one thing. But of course, people recognize that kind of insect production really is the base, the trophic basis for all the good fishing that's there, because the insects are fish food.
Does this have anything to do with the water quality? I mean, I didn't grow up in the Midwest, but I have I've heard of the things that the media picks up about water quality and how, especially in that area, there were issues over the period of many, many years with water quality. Did this have anything to do with that?
Very much so. The better the water quality, the more productive for these insects. And that's because the larval stages, or nymphs, as we call them, they're a burrowing mayfly, and they live in the sediments. And they dig a little tube, and they circulate water with air across their gills in the bottom of the lake. And if oxygen levels are depressed, those insects will go away.
I see.
And as pollution takes place, oxygen levels decline. A lot of the pollution is actually related to inputs of various chemicals, lawn chemicals and agrochemicals that cause increased like algal growth, for example, and that will ultimately result in oxygen saturation declines in the water. So the insect numbers would go down, and that has a negative impact on the fish. However, over time, with the various groups of people, public and private agencies, addressing the problems of like phosphate inputs into the lake, that was one big problem. And still is.
We still hear about the algal blooms in Lake Erie from time to time. Unfortunately, that's still a concern.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, those are cyanobacterial blooms in particular. And, phosphorus is commonly really limiting in freshwater systems. And so when people use phosphorus for phosphorus is used in supplemental feeds and animal feeding operations, chickens and pigs in particular. And because animals don't take up the phyton form of phosphorus very well, you have to supplement phosphorus into animal feed. And when you do that, there's a lot of leaching of that into the watershed, which ends up into the places like that, and it results in, there's a lot of story to this. But yes, and one of the other interesting things was the invasion of zebra mussel, which actually
Oh,
clarified the water, allowed more light penetration, and reduced particulates. And that has had the consequence of actually increasing mayfly populations. And
so
so,
what was going on when you were growing up? Was it that the zebra mussels were invading, allowing the
yeah,
flourishing, or was it just that the waters were less disturbed at that point?
when I was growing up, what I saw was the transition from bad water to much better water because of the addressing, especially of the phosphorus problem, which
I
was in
see.
detergents. People use them, there was phosphates in your laundry detergent,
Yeah,
and it would end up in the water. And so when the private sector said, okay, we'll stop putting phosphorus in detergents, and that greatly alleviated the problem. And the lake came back. One of the things that I've just been astonished with is how resilient a body of water like Lake Erie is. And, it became much healthier, more productive. There are all kinds of stories about Lake Erie and also, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio
oh
being
yeah,
on fire and
that's
things like
that's
that.
a famous
But
story. Have you read the book The Death and Life of the Great Lakes?
yes, I
Yeah,
have. I'm sort of a Great Lakes kid, basically. I grew up in the Great Lakes region, which is a great place in the US to grow up in, really. I mean, this is what 20% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes region. That's quite a statement. And so and of course, a lot of people live here. The history is interesting. The development of the use of those waterways for transportation and all of the kind of the iron, coal, car industry, steel thing that came together industrially.
that's right. Yeah,
All
it's
of that. There's just a huge, huge set of relationships economically there.
yeah. So going back to the mayfly story that you started with, is that what got you going in aquatic entomology, or how did you get started? Was it that you had an inspirational teacher that got you into biology, or you just
I
like
did.
observing the world around you? How did you get going?
Well, a couple of things. One is that my family was very oriented towards nature. We would do 4-week tent camping trips every summer. And
Oh,
we would
wow.
go, yeah, we would camp and we would drive long distances. We would drive from Ohio to the Rocky Mountains. We drove to the Northwest Pacific, into Canada, Yellowstone, Glacier National Park, um, the Grand Canyon, and we would just have these really long camping trips. And then I grew up fishing and boating, and so I was sort of absorbed in nature. So yes, that's one influence. Um, and then just back to the lake, besides mayflies, there were huge numbers of caddisflies that
Mm-hmm.
were also associated with the lake and the lakeshore, where the waves would wash in, and the caddisfly larvae had their populations right along the shore of the lake. And then thirdly was midges,
Oh, yeah.
chironomid midges. So, and they would sing at night. They'd form these huge swarms over trees, and you could just hear them at night like a song. And I remember as a boy thinking about all this, and it was just really kind of amazing. And then in high school, I had a biology teacher. His name was Jeff Williams, Mr. Williams. And he really forced us to do some important things. One was we had to make a leaf collection, and maybe students still do that. And I've always loved trees, and I still love trees. I love to go out and just look at trees. And that's one reason I love Michigan State University's campus, is because of the tree diversity. It's fun to go to work where you're basically in a tree garden.
Yeah, yeah.
And but with insects, we had to make an insect collection, and I loved it. And I did it with some of my neighbor friends.
And that was
And
in high school that you had to
it
do
was,
that?
I think, my sophomore
Nice.
year in high school. And I
Mhm.
remember collecting my first Io moth, one of the Saturn Io
Yeah.
moths. That was one of the first, but a Luna moths, and I recall watching a Luna moth. There was a female who was caught at our house. We had a screen door, and the female got somehow caught in the screen, but she was releasing calling pheromone. And all these male Luna moths were banging at the front door of our screen door. And I watched this and thought, what is going on here? So you see things like that. And then the other thing was cicadas. We had several large cicada populations, and I used to go out and collect the shells,
Mhm.
and I would try to get cicadas and put them in my collection. So I had an insect collection. Um, but then I kind of dropped that. And then, when I went to college, I went to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio.
Mhm.
And I actually was going to do pre-physical therapy. I had gotten interested in strokes. My godmother had had a stroke, and I watched her go through the process of therapy and recovery. And she told me about it and how therapists really helped her to recover her ability to speak and move. And I was fascinated by that. So I did pre-physical therapy, and I applied to one physical therapy school in my sophomore year in college. And that was really a mistake looking back. I should have finished my degree and applied after 4 years. I was too young, and I was competing with people who had 4-year degrees. And I approached it somewhat naively. And it was very competitive too.
Mhm.
And I was rejected. I had good grades. I had some experience. I'd done some observation work.
Mhm.
I'd actually done some patient hands-on work, but it discouraged me. But I was majoring in biology, zoology. And I thought, what should I do? So I thought about taking an entomology class. And this was in my sophomore year in college now.
So
And so
was that just a thought that came into your mind because you liked all these insects when you were growing up, or did you actually decide that you were going to leave physical therapy and try to find another vocation?
I hadn't decided that yet.
Okay.
And I had had all of these human anatomy classes and physiology, and I'd done my chemistry and physics series. So I had a really good science background and math. And so basically I had a good foundation in the basic sciences. But I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next. And I was really honestly kind of fishing around.
Hmm.
And so there was a course called medical entomology, and it was taught by the sole entomologist at Ohio University. His name was Bill Romoser. And in order to take that class, you were supposed to have had general entomology first as a prerequisite. So I went to his office, and he welcomed me in, and I explained to him that I'd like to take the class, but that I didn't have that prerequisite, and would it be okay to take it without it? And he said yes. And then we talked for a while. And within 10 minutes, he offered me a job in his lab.
I
He
remember you
needed
talking
somebody.
about that during your seminar and
Yeah,
how big of an influence.
it
It's
was huge.
amazing to me how much one person can influence the course of somebody's life.
It's really true. And I've become very sensitized to that, how we need to be welcoming. We get
Yeah.
a knock on our door. It's so easy to say, I'm busy, make an appointment, email me. I think we need to be willing to open the door, let somebody come in and say, I was in your position once.
Yeah.
I know exactly how you feel. And he was very much like that. But the interesting thing was, in about that 10-minute period, that kind of set the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Isn't that strange? It's so,
It's
life can be like this,
the
where you,
pivotal moment for your life.
yeah. And he also had an immediate problem, which is this: he was assigned to teach the basic biology lecture, like Biology 101 at that academic institution, and all of the lab sections. That was his job. He was a
Mm.
pretty new faculty member. And he said he had this interesting idea of, instead of using frogs for anatomical lessons where everybody would have to pith a frog and kill a frog, and nobody likes to do that stuff really. And he wanted to use American cockroaches instead. And he
Mm.
developed a set of labs on this. And he needed somebody to help him raise thousands of Paraplaneta americanum and
And
then set
you
up
were
the.
there.
I was there, and I said, yeah, show me what to do. I can do that. And I wasn't afraid to reach in and grab the cockroaches.
I'm
And
just laughing because it's
yeah,
hard to find a person that starts out their entomology career by raising thousands and thousands of cockroaches and still wants to
we
stick
had these
around for
big
more.
jars of them.
That's so
Yeah.
funny.
Well, I approached it enthusiastically, and we had, these, you could imagine these big, like, pickle jars with a gauze top, and and I had a whole rack of those. And to get the timing right, where we
Yeah.
had, where the lab for, let's say, I don't know how many students, 400 students probably. And we had to have adults. We needed nice big adults for this, and then
Mhm.
to do the preparations to get them ready. And then we had to actually do some anesthesia with those, so they'd hold still. So the students could start to work with them. And that was my intro. But then he had mosquito colonies, and he also had a couple of blowfly colonies, and I just learned under him. And he was mainly a developmental biologist. He studied some basic developmental processes and tissue transformations and things in mosquitoes. And I learned how to use a microtome and make slides and
Mm-hmm.
stain slides. And so I
That's
learned a
funny.
lot of,
So you became a medical entomologist even before you had any kind of degree in entomology. You were already getting that training. How
yeah,
funny. Yeah.
lucky me,
Yeah,
really.
it's
I was very
amazing.
fortunate.
So at that point you already knew working under him that this is what you wanted to do, right? Medical entomology was going to be your thing.
It was, and it was a funny sequence. I took medical entomology, and we were on quarter terms then, and that was in the winter. Then that spring, he offered a field entomology class, and I took that. Then the following fall, I took general entomology. So I took everything backwards. But I found out one thing I learned was that I could learn the insect names very easily for some reason. It just came to me. Like I've never been able to learn plant family names very well. For some reason, they
Interesting.
don't retain. But with insect names, the orders, the family names, and all that, it just was, I don't know, for some reason, I had a facility with it and I liked it. And as I worked with Bill, then he said, I've got this research project that's only halfway done and it needs more work. And could you work on it? It had to do with some timing of metamorphosis and molting events.
Uh-huh.
And it could be done with microscopy and histology. And I said, oh, well, show me what to do. I'll work on that. And he showed me. And I learned how to make, that's when I started doing the microtome work and staining. And I learned about various stain techniques and how to use, embed tissues in paraffin wax and all of this kind of thing. And again, a lot of skill development and the microscopy involved. And, photomicroscopy, taking pictures, developing film, which we had to do back then. I learned all of this. And then I got into my senior year. Now I'm working in his lab for almost 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you're good at this. Why don't you consider doing a master's degree where you just take this project, do one more year, and make it a sort of a BSMS in a 5-year period? And I said, sounds good. I would do that. And I liked living in Athens, Ohio. It's a nice town to live in. I had a lot of friends there, and I was playing a lot of music. I played guitar, and I was in a bluegrass duo with a banjo player at the time, and we were playing at some coffee houses and stuff.
Is
And
that how
so that
you
was
made
fun.
a extra income?
Little bit, little bit. I was also an RA in a dorm. I worked in the International House dormitory as an RA as an undergraduate, and loved it. And I continue to really have a strong kind of international philosophy,
And
which
you
we can talk
continue to
about.
play music, right?
Yeah, I've been in a lot of bands of various kinds, rock bands. I played electric guitar too. So music's always been a really important part of my life.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
both playing it and listening to it and appreciating other people who play it.
And you've
Um,
always been into bluegrass, or did you branch out into other?
no, that was actually something I discovered in Athens, which is an Appalachia part of the US.
Mm-hmm.
That's Southeast Ohio, with very hilly, a lot of coal miners, and that music is there.
Hmm.
And I learned it and met people who played it. And so that's what I learned. But it was not the only thing. I was mostly doing rock music in bands, I would
Mm-hmm.
say. Yeah, I was in a rock band in high school, and we would play at weddings and class reunions and all kinds of things. And actually, that band continued after I graduated from high school. And my band members, my friends, wanted me to stick with it as the guitarist in the band. but I was too far away. I was 4 hours away from where they were. Athens, Ohio is
Quite
southeastern
south.
Ohio. It's a
Yeah.
4 hour drive from, many of them were at Bowling Green State University or
Mhm.
University of Toledo, which was, I just couldn't make that kind of weekend drive. And so, yeah, I didn't have the drive to do that. And some of those people, those guys ended up music majors and they ended up being like band
Oh,
directors in high
wow.
schools, two of them. Yeah. At any rate, so I stayed with Bill and did
Mhm.
a 5th year basically. And that was at the time, this sort of concept of a BS/MS degree wasn't really developed. I mean, there was no formal program like that at Ohio
Mhm.
U. It's just something I ended up doing. But I really like it now. And I actually favor master's degrees. I think we need to go back to that. A lot of times people come out of a bachelor's degree and they immediately jump into a PhD
Mhm.
program, at least in some academic venues. And I'm not so much in favor of that. I think a master's degree is a really good intermediate step. And
Yeah, I
especially,
agree.
yeah, do you think so?
Yeah, yeah. It's
I don't
a
know
it's
if
a
you,
really
yeah,
big jump to go from a BS to a
yeah,
PhD, and a lot of people find out, I think, once they've already committed, and it's just a rough ride. Yeah.
it is. And you could really find yourself getting kind of wide-eyed looking around you and what's going on. But with a master's degree, you test yourself a little bit. Do I really like research? Do I like academia? Can I learn a little more about what other people do? And a master's degree has, if you do it right, it can give you some skills and some kind of build up your tool belt and your capacity, and it's marketable, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, during the course of my master's, I met with Bill again. I mean, we were friends by then, and he was also my mentor. And he said, I think you should look for a PhD program. I think you're good at this. And I said, really? I had not thought about that at all.
You
I was
haven't
thinking about,
considered a
maybe
PhD?
getting, no, I was thinking about getting a job like in a histology lab or a pathology lab, because I'd learned how to do basic kind of microscopy and making slides and staining and looking at tissues. And I thought, well, that I could do something with that. And
Mhm.
my older brother worked for a company that employed people like that, where they
Mm.
did like toxicology studies on mice and they had to look at tissues and things. And I thought I would look for a job, but then Bill Ramoser encouraged me to go look for a PhD program, and I did. So that was my next phase.
And so where did you go?
Well, I looked at several programs. I looked at University of Florida and I looked at Ohio State, and I actually was awarded a fellowship at Ohio State, which was really quite nice. But ended up at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. There was a fellow there named John Edmond, and he was a quite well-known medical entomologist with a specialty in mosquito vertebrate interactions. He was somebody who had worked a lot on like blood meal analysis, which is
Mhm.
a way to determine what animals mosquitoes had fed upon. And he used a method at the time which was state of the art, but now is very, very old school compared to the
Mhm.
molecular based methods we can use now. Um, and he interviewed me. And I remember when I went on my interview, this is a strange story. It was in the summer and I got sick. I had terrible gastrointestinal illness and I actually had a Norwalk virus infection.
Oh.
And I was vomiting and had diarrhea. And
That's
here
what
I
you
had to
want when
drive.
you're going for an
Oh, and
interview.
I was driving from Ohio to Massachusetts with this. I had to make all these stops on the New York Thruway, and I didn't feel good at all. But then I got there and the interview went well. He had a position, he had an RA position, and so it worked out. And then fall of 79, yeah, fall of 79, I moved to Amherst, Mass. And that was an entomology department, a small but really dynamic and good one. I mean, Ron Prokope was there at the
Wow.
time. Bernie Reutberg was a postdoc of Ron's. Ann Averill was a
Mm.
graduate student of Ron Prokope's. Um, so many really good people. And there was a funny kind of a Michigan State UMass connection because Ring Cardet and Joe Elkington, who were both at Michigan State, moved to
That's right.
UMass and took positions there. And I got to benefit from this because, I really got to learn from some really solid people.
Mhm.
I mean, Joe Elkington's insect ecology class is still one of the best classes I've ever taken. It's
Oh,
outstanding.
nice. Mm.
Do you know him by chance, or have you heard of him?
I have heard of him, but I don't
Okay.
know him. Yeah.
He's still there. He's on staff there still. And then John Clark arrived from Michigan State, and he had come from Fumio Matsumura's lab here at Michigan State in insect toxicology, and he was doing very advanced work. Uh, and let's see who else. So it was a small department, but
Small
really,
but
really
really
active.
strong. Yeah.
Yeah, and then among the other people, not in entomology, but in zoology, there was a very famous fly biologist named Vincent Detier. He
Mm.
wrote a book called To Know a Fly, and really famous, sort of at the level of Vincent Wigglesworth kind of insect
Oh,
physiology.
nice. Nice.
Yeah, and so there was this milieu, and then also there was a couple of really good parasitologists. And my advisor was part of a parasitology training grant from the NIH. And so the people that I got to interact with and be the research groups were really good. And it was some pretty rigorous training. I learned a lot, um, and kind of grew. I think I matured in ways that were good, and in several ways. Just seeing, kind of learning from different people that were doing different things. And
So were you
I was
working with mosquitoes at the
I
time?
was. I did
Yeah.
some work with viruses and with mosquito behavior,
So
and
that's
and
when you first got started with mosquitoes, right?
in a big way, where I
Yeah.
really started to do a deep dive.
Hmm.
I mean, with Bill Ramoser, it was really lab-oriented work, but now I was going to the field. I was trapping animals. I was bleeding them. I was testing for antibodies. I did 2 different internships at a virus lab, where I learned about how to work with viruses and isolate and identify them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it was an elevation in activity. And one thing in medical entomology is that it's much more than the insects. You really have to learn how to work with the pathogens and the vertebrate hosts. It's a field that's very horizontal in its demands, I think.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that
And
experience was there for me, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
did you start learning molecular skills while you were there? Because now you're using all sorts of
No,
molecular skills.
that was really not yet on the horizon. I
I
mean,
see.
there was no PCR yet when I was at John Edmonds'
Hmm. Hmm.
lab. It was just starting to appear, and yeah, that came later. And I moved to well, yeah, that came later. After I finished my PhD work, and by the way, I would mention that UMass, it was an all male, all white faculty, and we started. This was a transition, I think, away from a male dominated profession. There were many female graduate students, but there were no female faculty.
Hmm.
And I think I saw within the course of my lifetime quite a big change that happened relatively quickly. I
Hmm.
think within less than a generation, we saw the field change in a good way.
Hmm.
But at that time, it was a very male, kind of macho. Well, not kind of, it was, with a lot of sexism and
Uh-huh.
difficulty in. Yeah, so I thought, wow, some of these things are not good, like things you'd see and think, are we going to perpetuate this culture? You know, but perhaps that's another conversation. But it was true, and I think people would talk about it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, I mean, half of my PhD cohort was women
Right.
at UMass, and we really had a tight group of people. It was nice. It was really nice. All the graduate students were very close to each other. We had an active club, and we would do a lot together. And it was interesting. It was a good social situation. I made a lot of good friends. Yeah.
So, so after your PhD, did you end up with any postdocs or did you get a position right out of the PhD?
I had 2 postdocs, and out of my PhD, I immediately went to work with Dr. George Craig at University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana.
Mhm.
And I stayed there for about 2 years. And I worked with, he is a mosquito geneticist, but also had a very large program on all kinds of mosquito biological problems. And I focused on mosquito ecology. And I did a couple of different projects, but one was to assess in particular, there are two species of mosquitoes that are both tree hole mosquitoes. The larvae live in water-filled tree holes, and they're North American. They live around here. They're native species. And I studied their coexistent biology and their population dynamics and dispersal. And I did a lot of mark recapture experiments, and I had not done those before. And I learned a lot about mark recapture from and sort of more ecological kinds of things. I had done a lot of behavioral work, and then I did more ecology there
Mhm.
at Notre Dame. I also did a set of studies on the effect of virus infection on the fitness and behavior of mosquitoes, and that turned out to be produced a nice paper working with another faculty member there named Paul Grimstad. And then I did a few other things there. And as I moved along, there was a visit to the lab one day at Notre Dame, and it was from two profs from Michigan State. And one was a man named Rich Merritt, who was
Oh.
retired from entomology here. And another was a microbial ecologist named Mike Klug, who was at the Kellogg Biological Station.
Mhm.
And they had come to visit George Craig. And they were talking about a new project that they were developing, which had to do with how microorganisms cause decomposition of organic material. And this results in the microbial loop, which larval mosquitoes would feed upon. And there would be a sort of a nutrient and trophic transfer. And they were basically interested in the microbial basis of mosquito production. And Dr. Craig invited me to sit in on the conversation. And I listened. And then George Craig turned to me and he said, "Does this interest you, Ned?" And I said, "It's very interesting." And then he said to me, "These guys need somebody to do the mosquito
They're
work."
headhunting.
They were, because they didn't know the mosquito system, and they were working with the very tree hole mosquito that I had already worked with a lot.
Mhm.
And I said, wow, so here's an opportunity to make a move to Michigan State. And, I wasn't going to stay at Notre Dame forever.
Mhm.
It was not a permanent position. It was a postdoctoral position.
Mhm.
And so Rich Merritt and Mike Klug, they interviewed me and hired me. And I remember coming up, it was about February of '86, I think that's when I started at Michigan State. And I was a postdoc. So it would have been my second
At
postdoc.
KBS or
I
on
really
main
kind of
campus?
wanted to be at KBS, but no, Rich wanted me on the main campus, which was fine.
Mhm.
And so I moved there, moved to East Lansing. And then, and we had an NIH grant, which was paying my salary. And it went for 3 years. And then we had a lapse in it. And Rich was able to support me a little bit longer on a black fly study. So I got to do some black fly research for a while. And then I got a consulting opportunity in Honduras to work on for the US AID and the Ministry of Health in Honduras on malaria control. And I had some
Oh,
Spanish.
wow.
Yeah, I had some Spanish already. So I was able to do that for a while because the grant that we had was not renewed to pay my salary.
Mhm.
However, I still had an affiliation with Michigan State on the books. We reapplied for the grant, and this time Rich Merritt, who is moving on to other things, he said, "Why don't you take this NIH grant over and you apply now?" And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, you be the PI." He was starting to work on, I forget, a lot of forensic work, and he had gotten a new study in Alaska on salmon decomposition or something. I'm trying to remember all the details, but it was very nice of Rich to sort of hand this off.
Mhm.
And I said, okay. And to be honest, I think it'd be fair to say I had kind of taken it over professionally to a certain extent anyway, leading it. And it was actually funded again. And at that time, Michigan State then opened up a medical entomology position. Don Newsom had retired, and a position opened up, and there had to be some political discussion about this position. At any rate, I applied for it and I interviewed for it along with two other people. And I actually got the job. It was offered to me. And I could say the two other people were Susan Paskowitz, who ended up at University of Wisconsin, is actually the chair of entomology there now. And the other person was Roger Nashi, who went to the CDC and he was the head of the CDC Fort Collins mosquito-borne disease section for years. So the competition was good. I felt good about that, that was something that I could stand up to. And so I started on my faculty position at Michigan State in September of 1990.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool that you were already here at Michigan State and up and running, and you were able to
Yeah.
just slide into the position and keep going with it. Was it pretty obvious to you that you were going to work with mosquitoes for the most part, or because you had this other project on black flies and you worked with blowflies and other insects, medically related insects before, did you think that you were going to work on all sorts of different things?
I didn't know. The mosquito work took off well, and I started getting involved in as I had a part-time extension appointment. My appointment was kind of funny. I had only a 9-month appointment, but I still had extension responsibilities. And my extension appointment was 1/3. And then I had 1/3 experiment station and 1/3 support from the College of Natural Science. So I had to raise my summer salary. So I used to say I had a 4-way appointment. And that went on for years.
Same here.
Yeah. And I question the administrative wisdom of something like that, but sometimes we have these cobble job kinds of arrangements, which are they can be a little bit unhealthy, I think, for the people in them. And then I met some people doing international work, and I got a project going with a colleague on mosquito-borne filariasis in the Philippines, and that was my first. After my Honduras experience, then to get a 2-year project in the Philippines was very nice. And I really got into that tropical setting and did some work there and enjoyed it. And then I also started to work on ticks and Lyme disease in the 1990s. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is basically I'm a self-taught tick person, but there was really no tick work in Michigan at all. There was just some really old kind of small studies from the 50s. And it was a huge gap in this area. And then with the emergence of the Lyme disease problem, which is now huge, it's absolutely a huge thing.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, we better address this. So I went and found as many different tick sources as I could from as many different databases and collections as possible, and my own work. And actually, I got a small CDC grant to do some Lyme disease work in the 90s in the UP. So I was making a lot of trips to the Upper Peninsula for that, a lot of field work, and started to do the bacteriology. We would actually isolate and grow Borrelia burgdorferi and characterize it. And so I began to do tick work in parallel with mosquito work. And we published a paper in 1998, which is basically called The Ticks of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And it was the first paper that sort of summarized everything that we knew about the ticks of Michigan up to that point. And that was really good. And since that time, the situation has really changed, but that was my beginning of non-mosquito work. Mm-hmm. And I also did a little bit of work on deer flies and horse flies. That was another big gap. There had been one paper published on the deer flies and horse flies in Michigan in the 1950s. And so I worked with an undergraduate student who went on to medical school, and we did a 2-year study of the deer flies and horse flies of Lake Lansing Park North.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Huh. Yeah, I know firsthand that there's a lot of biting flies out there. Oh my gosh.
We estimated,
this summer you have to go with all sorts of sprays and nets and whatnot.
Yeah, we estimated 1,000 deer fly landings per person per hour of hiking on the trails.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But the diversity was amazing. And to work on an insect group like that, which was really different, and mean, we have like 95 species of deer flies and horseflies and tabanids
Yeah.
in Michigan. And it's a really interesting situation. It's very interesting. We have a species called Tabanus americanus, which is a relict population. It occurs in the southeastern US, but here we have this little population in southeastern Michigan with a big gap of
Wow.
land with in between, and things like that, and some other really interesting species. So that was, I'd love to go back and work on them some more, actually. And they're pretty economically important. Disease-wise, not so important, but I mean, I used to get calls from golf courses and they'd say, what can we do about these deer flies? You
Mhm.
know, so things like that. So that was good.
There's a lot of work out there to be had. But one
Huge.
person that was brought on was Jean Tsao, who is now working
Yes,
on ticks. So I know you two have had a pretty fruitful collaboration on ticks, right?
we have. And then when Jean came, and she's in fisheries and wildlife, um, and she had quite a bit of experience working on Ixodes scapularis, the tick that species that's involved in Lyme disease transmission, and a suite of other pathogens, by the way. That's not the only one. There's others that are even maybe more alarming.
Hmm.
And when she arrived in the, I think, gosh, in the 2000s at some point, I don't remember exactly when she got here. Uh, and then I basically said, Gene, ticks are yours. I still like to work on them, but it's important for her to find her space, and she certainly has. She's very professional and can do her own thing. But and then I started in the late 90s. I really wanted to work on malaria, and I wanted to get another international project going. And I wanted to take my tree hole mosquito work and somehow relate it to Anopheles biology in Africa. And I had a colleague from University of Notre Dame whose name was Bill Hawley. And he had moved from Notre Dame to the CDC. And Bill had lived in Malaysia for many years, and he was very experienced in international work. And the CDC hired him in their malaria branch. And he and his family had moved to Nairobi. And Bill was heading up a large mosquito and malaria research program on behalf of the CDC's global health programs in Kenya. And this is kind of an interesting story, actually. Bill and I were quite good friends, and I was good friends with his wife, Carol. And in 1998 was a terrorist event where terrorists blew up the US Embassy in Nairobi and also the US Embassy in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania.
Hmm.
And Bill Hawley was in Nairobi at the time, and his wife was in the embassy when it was blown up. She was an employee for she ran basically the embassy post office, what they call the APO.
Hmm.
And she and a colleague, a Kenyan colleague, were actually pushing these carts of mail up an incline in the basement of the embassy out towards the back door, these big sliding metal doors where somebody was going to come and pick up this mail and distribute it to other locations, right? And that's where the bomber drove the truck in, right, was right
Oh,
there. And she was badly injured. She amazingly survived this episode. Her colleague
wow.
was killed. Many people were killed in the embassy, but the building collapsed on top of her. But she was later found alive, and Bill, went with her to first a U.S. Air Force base in Germany where she was treated for the trauma, and then to San Antonio, Texas, where the U.S. military maintains a hospital for badly injured people. And I called him. I heard about this. I found out where he was. I called his hotel room, and we talked. And the funny thing was, he said, you should come to work in Kenya.
After this,
After this,
right?
I said, Bill, what are you talking about? And he said, no, it's a great place to work. You'd love it. And I said, well, how can we do this? And he said, well, think about it. So at the time, the Fogarty International Center, which is an NIH organization, they had these little grants, international collaboration grants called FIRCAs, Fogarty International Research Collaboration Agreement. And he said, use your current NIH grant to write a FIRCA, and I'll hook you up with Kenyans to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And I did, and I got it. And in 1999, a year later, I was in Nairobi. I was working now. I had a new 3-year collaboration, which I developed, and we took our ideas about mosquito production from aquatic habitats and transferred them to Anopheles mosquitoes that lived in little mud puddles, basically. And the Anopheles species that carry malaria, Anopheles gambiae, Anopheles rabiensis, Anopheles fenestis. And
I
so out of that tragedy,
Yeah, I think I remember some of this work because I was a graduate student right next to Jim Miller's lab at the time, and he was
yeah,
working on this project with you. I believe that you were collaborating with him, and he was studying
yes,
the behavior side of things. And he was telling me all sorts of very interesting stories
that's right.
about like how in the water that accumulates in footprints of animals
Yeah,
was something that they were studying, and of course then the bed nets that they were studying for malaria
yeah,
control. Yeah,
that's
very
right.
interesting.
And once as this little international collaboration agreement project went along, I realized I could expand this into something larger. So the NIH has something called R01 grants, which are nice. You could get a 5-year award. And so I wrote a new project on that. And I asked Jim Miller in entomology at Michigan State to collaborate. And we were going to do two things. We were going to study the production of these mosquitoes. What are the factors that control production of the Anopheles mosquitoes from their larval habitats? There was hardly any work done on this at all. And then the second thing was we were going to study how they decide where to lay their eggs, behavioral ramifications of the microbes and the smells and odors of, you know, which Jim Miller is an expert in insect egg laying behavior, insect oviposition.
Mhm.
And by gosh, we wrote this grant and we got it. So Jim and I started to travel together to Kenya. And we hired Joanne Wong, who was our postdoc and had come
Mhm.
from Jim Tumlinson's lab in Florida. And she moved up to Michigan State and worked with us on that. And she's still here at Michigan State, I think in the fruit area now. And and then a second opportunity came along because there was a call for proposals to look at the behavioral elements of insecticide treated bed nets from the NIH. It was an international kind of collaboration network also. And that's called a U01 grant, a program project grant. And we got that too. And Jim and I were looking at each other like, what is going on here? And so we really had a lot of activity in Africa over an extended period of time, very fruitful, a lot of productivity, wonderful collaborations. And we formed up, Jim Miller and I formed up quite a partnership. I miss him. I really miss having Jim
I
around.
miss him too, and he was very good to just talk to. He was very available, and he would take you out to lunch or have a cup of coffee and just chit chat. That's why I found out all about this project, because I just was there and we had great conversations, and I miss that, because we're in a pandemic, and because a lot of the times we just don't have these opportunities anymore. Everybody's so busy running around. But I just wanted to say that so you had just given the department seminar this past Monday, and I really appreciated it. But I remember another presentation that you gave, which was also a department seminar. This was years, like more than a decade ago, easy. And it was about your international activity. At that time, you kind of wanted to, summarize, I think, in a sense, what you had done in your international activities, and I really appreciated that. And I think that was the first time that I've heard you give a seminar. And uh, I just wanted to say that you speak with such clarity, at least
Oh,
the way that
thank
my
you.
mind is organized is it's easy for me to take in what you're saying, and it's very easy for me to follow and remember things. And that's why I remember still that seminar. Like, how many department seminars do I remember? I can probably count on one hand how many I remember, and the slides, I still see them in front of my eyes. But it was amazing, and I really appreciate the kind of work that you're doing too. I think it's so very important. So I think that more people should do these kinds of seminars where they look back on what they had done over a period of time and summarize the body of work that they have put forward, and really try to come to a conclusion of how they have moved the field forward. And I think that's what you're doing in these seminars, as well as identifying the path forward. And it's great. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm very much appreciative of it.
Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind to say that. I really appreciate that. I get pretty passionate about some of the things I've worked on, and that's one area where I'm pretty passionate about it. My attitudes have changed too. I've learned a lot about malaria. I've done a lot of work on it elsewhere, Papua New Guinea, Malawi, a little bit in Madagascar, which is a fascinating place to visit. Oh my gosh. And but one thing I've learned is that we try to throw technology like a better bed net or a new drug or a vaccine against a problem like malaria, when the problem with malaria is poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Malaria exists because people are poor.
Mm-hmm.
And if we really want to solve the malaria problem, we have to have less poor people. And I mean, we've done some studies, particularly in Kenya and in Malawi, that there's a linear relationship between your household wealth index and your malaria risk in your household.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so obvious to me. And the other thing that's interesting is that there's a relationship between the education level of the female head of household in a house and the malaria risk. So
And
when we
many
think,
other things.
I know, and then maybe these are universal things, but here we are taking our kind of our Western mindset that we need a better technology and we need a better tool or set of tools, when in fact, these are really sociological problems. And one of the great things that I've benefited from has been working with social scientists who have a different perspective. And they look at things in a way which really adds clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And I have appreciated that now looking back, and things I think about, like like the poverty relationship. And I've read some things about like a universal basic income and things like that, and I think these things make sense. We really there's too much wealth and too few hands, and we need to loosen up all that wealth and distribute it better so that people who are poor benefit, and society will be better. Things will be safer, people will be healthier, people will be happier, children will be better off, women will be better off. All of these things that I've come to see that have nothing to do with entomology or really, you know what I mean, in a direct way. And so, and my international experiences to me have revealed that. And I, not that those questions aren't still interesting, they are. I continue to be fascinated by, especially like mosquito host selection. How do mosquitoes end up biting who and when and where and why? And we've gotten some really fun studies, interesting studies on that.
Mm-hmm.
And other things too. But these sociological elements and social scientist contributions to what we do, I think we should really pay more attention to.
I couldn't agree more. And I was just thinking about this in my own work, and my work is much more focused locally on Michigan. But I do think that without understanding the barriers to adoption of the technologies that university research develops, I think we can do all the things that we do in the lab or in the field in research projects, but they're not going to get adopted on a wide scale. So I think that, yeah, working closely with social scientists is the way to go forward,
Yeah.
where we gap these barriers.
Yes.
Um, I also think that, just, I guess, to summarize at the end here, if anybody's interested in working internationally and with organisms that have a really, really wide-ranging impact, medical entomology is the way to go. Like I said, my work with vegetable entomology is much more locally focused. It's not as what it there could be ways to make it go around the world, but yours, I think, lends itself much more naturally to these kinds of international collaborations than what
Yeah,
I'm doing. So I think that for younger scientists that may be listening to this, one takeaway when you're choosing what field to go into, and that's why I was asking you earlier whether you deliberately stuck with mosquitoes, because I think in my choice of postdocs or how I was going to land the position, it was less obvious that I was working in one system and I was going to get going with that system and keep going throughout my career. It was more open to different choices of I can go this way or I can go that way. And so there are these flexible points in your career when you can have a choice to say, okay, I know why I'm sticking with this organism or this field versus I want to have more of an international focus or experience. Therefore, I'm going to be switching to this other field. And I don't, I'm saying this because I didn't have this kind of insight when I was younger. I do now, but I wish I had, or I wish somebody
yeah,
was there to sit down with me and talk over these kinds of issues. Um, but once you're like, further down the path, it's much harder to make these kinds of changes. So there are stages at your career where you can and where it's much harder to do the
I
decisions.
agree. Yeah, and that's where maybe some good mentorship is useful, and lots of conversations, and meet people and try things and be somewhat bold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and international work can be really difficult, to maintain linkages and sustain it, and do the travel involved and all of that. It's challenging, but
Especially
it's very
now.
rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Ned, so much for coming onto the podcast. And
Thank
it was
you.
fascinating to talk with you and learn all about the things that I didn't know about your background. And I want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast. And we'll see you in the next one, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.